Well, we'll get started. Good morning, everyone. My name is Marlo Paventi. I'm the Senior Director for Public Policy and Government Affairs here at Long Island Board of Realtors. And we have a very special presentation today. We are joined by Zach Rubin McCary from NAR and Mr. Michael Kelly from NYSAR. So I'm just going to go ahead and introduce them. Zach is the manager of RPAC Federal Disbursements for NAR, where he is the staff executive for RPAC Federal Disbursements trustees who govern the spending of federal RPAC dollars. In addition, he works with a group of 13 states and territories, including American Samoa, California, Hawaii, Guam, New York, New Jersey, Washington, Oregon. There's a bunch of them. There's a whole bunch of them. So I'm just going to move past that. Zach worked on federal campaigns across the country, and as a legislative staffer in Congress for Representative Sean Patrick Maloney in New York. Zach he lives in Washington. He's a native of Washington, and he's a graduate of the Ohio State University. We're also joined by Mr. Mike Kelly. Prior to joining the Realtor family in 2001, Mike worked for 8 years in the New York State Assembly, directing communication efforts for several assembly members working on multiple political campaigns and serving as an analyst on the Assembly Ways and Means Committee. Mike became NYSAR's Director of Government Affairs in 2008. Mike is a proud graduate of the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, and he has 2 adult children and lives outside of Albany with his wife, Beth. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us today. As everybody knows, they're going to be giving us a legislative and political update of what's happening at the national and state and city level. I'm just here to tell you that if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A and we will get to them after. Gentlemen, I'm going to hand it off to you. Thank you for joining us today. Zach, go ahead and get us started.
Great. I appreciate the introduction, Marlo. I want everybody to realize while Mike gives me a hard time about being the Ohio State University, the bio he provided Marlo said the Nebraska university. So I conclude my update. We're done there. But happy to be here. It's great to see you all. I always welcome an opportunity to talk to Long Island and New Yorkers and share the stage with Mike and Marlo. So DC, there's a little bit of policy stuff going on this year. I think kind of looking back a little bit, it's important. We got past a big potential crisis in the debt limit. That there was a deal reached late, earlier this month, excuse me. That was very exciting. We were very concerned about what that might do to the market if the U.S. did default, what it could do to the mortgage market, particularly as, we've seen rates increase and all of that. The deal that was reached was pretty bipartisan and, ended up, Speaker McCarthy did need Democratic votes to pass it. The other interesting thing, it did include reform for permitting, which for major infrastructure projects, that's a really important thing and a thing that we've supported over the years and hopefully, can help long term. It's just to study it, but, it's a step in the right direction. I think it's important to note that debt limit deal because it also created a little bit of, we'll say, consternation amongst the Republican, more conservative members of the Republican caucus. And it's important to kind of have that in the back of your mind as you're reading stories and hearing about, what's going on the Hill, because, looking ahead to September, they do need to pass a budget to fund the government. And given how this deal played out and that Speaker McCarthy needed Democratic votes to pass it, and they did pass it on a bipartisan basis, that is something that really frustrated his conservative flank and is going to make coming to any other future legislative deals that much harder. And since it's a very narrow majority Republicans have, it's going to mean that end of September deadline, that funding deadline, I feel like every time I'm in New York for the fall meetings I talk about, that's going to be very important because funding the government obviously funds all sorts of programs we care about, but it also involves the National Flood Insurance Program, which if that expires could cause a lot of issues in the market. So we're monitoring this very closely. We've continued talking to people about how important it is to make sure that the government gets funded and we're not, kind of playing around with this. I expect there'll be ongoing conversations behind the scenes, but this is the type of thing that we're, usually we tend to go up closer to the deadline on. Beyond that, there's a number of other things we're focused on. The biggest right now is taxes. As some of you may recall, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, a number of those provisions expire at the end of 2025. So there's 23 items that were in that original bill that expire. A number of popular provisions like the expanded child tax credit, decreased income tax rates. Also, it would the cap on state and local tax deduction would also expire then, which is of note and interesting. So as a result of that, it's created a dynamic where both Democrats and Republicans are interested in doing something on taxes. That is going to start, and you'll start to see in the news, I think, more and more conversation from people. The Republicans are slated to release kind of their first kind of crack at what a tax bill might look like if they got everything they wanted. I will note our expectation is they won't include anything on salt in that, and I'll get to that in a second. But it's kind of a starting point for their negotiations with Democrats. The Republicans, as I mentioned, they have a lot of drama within their ranks right now. One of them on the tax side of things is salt. So one of the silver linings for Democrats who want to see change on salt and losing a lot of seats in New York was that there was a number of Republicans that got elected, particularly on Long Island, that do care a lot about salt. So Congressman LaLota, D'Esposito, those guys have been working really hard alongside Mike Lawler and Garbarino, who's leading the SALT caucus on. They've created a pretty large group of Republicans who have said, look, you got to do something about salt in any sort of tax bill. So, there's about 10 of them between those folks I just mentioned, as well as a few in California and New Jersey that are kind of, they're saying to, their leadership, hey, look, we helped you get the majority. This is something that's really important for us and our constituents. We need to see some movement here. So while it's not included in the Republican kind of negotiating package that might get released, just know that there is a group of Republicans working behind the scenes to make sure something gets done on that. Now, what that looks like, that's anybody's guess. It's something that kind of oddly enough, if you're a super conservative Republican, they like the idea of expanding the salt cap because they realize, okay, something needs to happen here. But if we go back to the before times where there was no cap, that's a bigger hit to the deficit than having a cap at, $80,000 or whatever it ends up being, or 20. So I think there's an opportunity for a deal there, particularly with all the Democrats who are interested in doing something on it. But it's something that I think is going to really seem like a political football the next couple months and leading into next year, particularly after the election. Any sort of addressing of the taxes, I don't think will happen until after the election. Both Democrats and Republicans are feeling a little bit optimistic about their chances for different reasons, and don't want to really cut a deal until they know who's going to be in the White House and who's going to control the various chambers. The other thing on taxes for housing supply, we've also been pushing a number of bills. The Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, for those of you who are down in for mid-year, or Realtor legislative meetings, that's been one of the bills we've been talking about. It's from Congressman Higgins in New York, who's actually on President's Circle. This is a great bill. We're very excited about it. It helps in rehabbing older homes that maybe it doesn't quite make sense to do without a tax incentive, be able to flip it and get a family into those homes. So it helps to create some tax incentives to put a little bit more supply on the market. We're also looking at commercial conversions. There's a number of bills that we support, tax credits and that sort of thing that are going on. We've also, there's a lot of interest on housing issues. The other big bill that we've been pushing It's called the More Homes on the Market Act. This bill would double the capital gains exclusion for selling a home. So it would double it for an individual from 250 to 500,000, and then for couples up to $1 million, and then peg it to inflation. So that's a bill that we're very supportive of. It was introduced by Jimmy Panetta and Mike Kelly, Congressman Mike Kelly from Pennsylvania. That's something that, kind of looking at that backdrop of what we're expecting with the election, we're very focused on making sure it's a bipartisan bill. So we're helping both those legislators find bipartisan couples or pairs to go on together. So if you look at the co-sponsors, it's 1D and 1R. And the reason for that is, while there's a ton of Democrats who love this idea, if Republicans take over, it's going to be very easy for them to write this bill off. But if we're able to go to them and say, hey, look, we've got 40 co-sponsors on this, 20 Dems, 20 Republicans, everybody likes this, you should include it. There's a better argument to be made to include that in any sort of future tax provision, particularly as housing supply is a real big issue that people are on both sides of the aisle are worried about. Moving on to some other policy issues, I mentioned the National Flood Insurance Program. Obviously, we're very focused on that September deadline for funding. The other thing is that risk rating 2.0 is recently rolled out. Some of you may be familiar with this, but it is a new rate setting program from the National Flood Insurance Program. It does involve more advanced technology on how they're doing rates. It could result in minor increases depending on where your property or your client's property is. So it's definitely something I would look into. We have a lot of great resources on our website on what it means, how it works. NAR was actually involved in helping to draft it, so wanted to make sure to put that on your radar, and happy to share some of that stuff with Marlo to share with you all afterwards. Excuse me. A couple other things. Some of you may have read about the loan level pricing adjustments that were in the news about basically mortgage increases that it was reported would subsidize first-time home buyers by making rates a little bit higher for more qualified buyers. While it's not exactly how they were working, that was how it was reported in the press. This was probably about 3 or 4 weeks ago. This is something they did repeal one of them, which was great. We're working with them on trying to make things a little bit better on those, because our basic policy on all this is that in this market and this rate environment, it's not the time to increase fees on people. So that'll be an ongoing thing. And also, our president, Kenny Parcell, he actually testified in front of the House Financial Services Committee on this issue on a subcommittee hearing, and actually Congressman Garbarino was in attendance and asked him some great questions. So that was really good too. So it's an issue we're continuing to monitor, and hopefully they'll kind of reach the same conclusion our research and policy teams have as well. Looking ahead with the excuse me, with the elections, I mentioned those are looming large. It's going to make passing major legislation kind of tough over the next year. If you look particularly on the Republican side, you have a lot of senators that are either considering runs for president or have already announced. In a 50-50 Senate, that is going to make it very hard to have the amount of people you need to pass legislation. So while the budget, we think funding the government will happen at some point, we don't expect a ton of major legislation happening next year. And also on the House side, I mentioned earlier, Republicans, they have a very narrow majority. There are a lot of seats in New York that both the Democrats and Republicans are going to be likely spending a lot of money in. So in the fall, I'd probably say use your TiVo, maybe stop watching TV. Your ads are going to be overrun. All of these races are really competitive. I think Democrats, they think they can win some of those seats back, particularly on Long Island. So, excuse me. So they'll likely be working there to win those seats back. On the Senate side, it's a tough road for Democrats to hold on to the Senate, for Schumer to remain majority leader. they have a lot of seats they're defending that are going to be really, really tough. So it's going to be interesting to watch there. And, we're watching all those very closely. Those are kind of the big things that we have going on here. I wanted to, we'll have time at the end for questions, but I guess kick things over to Mike if he wanted to update on the state and the city.
And Mike, before you get started, I just want to remind everybody, if you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box below in your screen. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Marlo. And obviously, thank you again for the invite. Wish we were doing it in person, but I hope to see you soon, hopefully this summer. I don't know, maybe we can do an RPAC fundraiser at a winery or something where everyone wins. Well, thank you.
In our jurisdiction, so we can't do that. We can talk later about.
We can find a winery somewhere close. Zach, I appreciate your comments about my alma mater. Although we have struggled more recently on the athletic front, I think I got a terrific education and a steal. So we'll leave it at that. So again, thank you, everybody. I'll talk about real quickly just what's happening in Albany, what happened actually during lobby day, while state government was about a month late in passing their statutorily required enacted state budget, and then just quickly on some things that are happening in the midst of what we're calling end of session, but it's not really end of session yet because I think the assembly is going to come back next week for a 2-day special session. So let me just turn to my notes real quick. In terms of the enacted state budget, just a couple things that were in the budget of note that deal with electrification. This effort by the state to shift to more renewable resources to decarbonize New York State, to reduce carbon emissions. The first one being probably the most important to us is beginning December 31st, 2025, all new residential, all new buildings, I should say, 7 stories or less, are going to have to be all electric. All buildings built on or after December 31st, 2028. So essentially the remaining of those buildings, larger buildings, et cetera, commercial buildings, are going to be all electric beginning on that date. So the first date, probably more applicable to us, is that December 31st, 2025. We raised concerns both on the earlier retrofit proposal as well as this new construction proposal about the increased cost in these homes, removing consumer choice. We've made comments about grid reliability and whether the grid can handle this. The good news is, at least on the grid questions that we're raising, the New York State Fire Prevention and Building Code Council is going to be required to consider the ability of the grid to handle this upload where these new communities are being developed, where this new electric requirement is going to be applied in that new construction. And if the grid can't handle it, then those buildings won't be built. So a lot more to come on this, as the Building Code Council yet is not promulgated their regulations with regard to this new electrification of the construction of new buildings in New York State. The second one on the environmental front was the creation of a new climate action fund. So you can think of this as, some of you in the past have probably heard of a cap and trade or cap and invest. Essentially, the State Department of Environmental Conservation is going to be releasing draft plans on how to do this by 2024. It places a limit on the total carbon emissions allowed statewide, and it provides businesses and carbon polluters, carbon emitters, the ability to purchase credits if they're going to exceed essentially their limit. And those companies are going to have to buy these credits if they're going to exceed these certain carbon emission thresholds, still again to be determined by DEC. And the revenues from the purchase of these credits are going to go to offset this transition from a carbon-based economy to an all-electric renewable economy for lower income individuals and small businesses across New York State. So again, a lot more to come on that because we don't even have the regulations yet. But that's going to be coming by the end of 2024, at least the regulatory side of it. And the last thing coming out of the enacted state budget was there will be new lead paint regulations for residential properties outside of New York City. So the New York State Department of Health is required to develop a registry for all residential dwellings in what the legislation is deemed a community of concern. I don't know what that means. I think just anecdotally, I would suggest that it probably means higher density centers with older historic buildings, my guess is, where there probably is some track record of, people having health concerns as it's tied to lead paint. So the DOH is going to identify these communities of concern. This regulation is going to, or this requirement, I should say, is going to apply to buildings built prior to 1980 with 2 units or more outside of New York City. So think Long Island, think all of the rest of New York State. The owners of properties that meet that criteria are going to have to certify that their building is lead-free, free of lead paint hazards, or they're going to have to remediate the property in accordance with municipal laws and regulations, certifying essentially that that property is going to be lead-free. So again, more to come. I don't know where the communities of concern are. We're going to be paying attention to these DOH regulations, but we will have to see. The end of session. So the legislature enacted the state budget on May 2nd, our lobby day. They wrapped that up, and then in about 1 month, they ran through an end of session. And I would say probably the last 7 days, not unheard of, are the most hectic and the most crazy. And this is where really a lot of bad things typically happen, because they're passing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bills at one time. And the challenge is, from a lobbying perspective, not just for me and for our staff, is any other business or industry, is to try and garner the attention of a lawmaker when essentially their heads are spinning trying to deal with those lawmakers trying to get their priority bills done, and hundreds and hundreds of bills getting to the floor and being debated every single day. So what happened in the last couple of weeks of note? I will tell you, I think the most important thing that happened was there was no overall agreement on housing once again. And I say that there's some positive to that, and there's a lot of frustration, I think, to that as well. You remember Governor Hochul, for the first time in at least 20 years, I've been with the Realtors now 21, for the first time, a sitting governor of New York said, we need to do something about housing in New York State. We don't have enough supply. And the legislature reacted on par with a lot of local government officials and said, we don't need Albany to tell us how to handle zoning, how to handle ADUs, how to handle basement apartments, how to handle supply issues. We got it. Don't need it. Thanks so much, Governor Hochul. So the legislature punted that out of the conversation as it was happening in budget negotiations. And there was some hope to get to an agreement post-budget in that 1 month span between enactment of the state budget and before lawmakers were scheduled to wrap up the 2023 legislative session. So nothing was really moving until about the last 2 days, when several lawmakers, Democrats from both houses, formed essentially kind of a housing task force, they called it. And they put together a package of bills just conceptually, and offered it to the governor. And so there wasn't a bill printed. There wasn't a bill that got to the floor of either house of the legislature for their consideration. But essentially, this task force went to the governor and said, Governor, we think we need to do something on housing. Here's what we propose. We propose expanding 421A and reinstituting it. You'll remember that this is a New York City tax incentive to develop affordable housing, and it provides the developer with certain tax breaks for that overall project. Progressive Democrats in both houses really don't look, fondly upon this. That's why they let it expire several years ago. But in reality, without those tax incentives provided by 421A, there has been very, very little development of affordable housing in New York City since its expiration. So that was part of the offer. Housing vouchers were also offered. This is a program that NYSAR has been supportive over the last couple of years. These are state-funded vouchers, similar to other housing vouchers provided at the federal level, Section 8, et cetera, that would address the housing needs of people most at risk of being evicted. Also in that package was legislation requiring another piece to this eviction protections, and that's known as right to counsel. Right to counsel is a law in New York City right now. NYSAR is supportive of a bill pending in the legislature that would expand that program beyond the borders of New York City to the entire state. So if you were going to be evicted from your property, you would have the right to counsel. Now, right to counsel in real world terms, not perfect in New York City in particular right now, because there aren't enough attorneys to provide that counsel to the number of individuals pending eviction in New York State. So although it's not a perfect solution, it's definitely something that I think would enhance eviction protections, while at the same time not going as far as what we know as good cause eviction. And unfortunately, whether it was intentional or not, I think it probably was intentional. Good cause eviction was also part of this platform that this housing task force provided to the governor. And this is what I would call the poison pill in this package. So the governor was not going to sign on to a housing package that included good cause eviction. She had already made it clear that she wasn't going to do that. She had actually already made it clear that she didn't support housing vouchers either. So the legislature says, well, we're gonna throw this package to the governor and let her decide what she wants to do in housing. And the governor said, guys, you come to me with 48 hours left in the legislative session. You hand me a package of proposals that I'm against half of them. We're not doing this. So right now, what you see is a little bit of the blame game happening here in Albany. The legislature, in a joint statement last week, said the governor didn't accept our offer, and we're not going to do a housing package without good cause eviction. The governor says, you didn't send me a single bill, and you took this up with 48 hours to go in the legislative session. And this is an issue that deserves and warrants more attention than that. So the good news is good cause eviction didn't happen, at least temporarily. The bad news is neither did anything else in the housing space. So if you can tell, I'm a little bit frustrated by this, because unfortunately, I think without addressing, and I think the governor's right on this issue, without addressing the housing supply issue that we face, rents and housing costs just simply aren't going to come down. Other things that were notable that were approved by both houses. So these things I'm going to talk about for a couple minutes here are bills that passed by both houses that still have yet to go to the governor yet. So I don't know where the governor stands on these yet. The first one is a bill that's been kicked around for a little while now in a couple different iterations. There are lawmakers that are trying to get at this current ability of sellers of residential real property to avoid having to provide the property condition disclosure statement by providing a $500 credit to the buyer in lieu of completing the PCDS. So last year there was a bill that was proposed that dealt with flood issues, and then NYSAR spoke to a lot of lawmakers about it, actually again in the waning hours of the session last year, and that bill didn't move anywhere. But that bill also eliminated the $500 opt-out / credit. So this year, that issue was back once again, a different version of the bill. So this bill, Senate Bill 5400 and Assembly Bill 1967, does two things. One, it eliminates the $500 opt-out, right? So all sellers of residential real property per this bill will have to fill out the PCDS and provide it information about their property to the best of their knowledge to that prospective purchaser. And then it also adds several questions related to the property's flood history and flood insurance, and adds those questions to the PCDS. So that bill passed both houses and is going to go to the governor for her consideration. We'll have to see. NYSAR is opposed to that bill. We're not opposed to the additional flood questions. We're just opposed to the removal of the $500 option for the seller of the property. The irony here is when we first drafted this law, this is back when I first started at NYSAR in 2001, we were in the midst of working on this PCDS law with, at the time, Assemblymember Richard Brodsky, who has since passed away. NYSAR was in line with what this bill wants to do. We didn't support a $500 opt-out or credit, but Assemblymember Brodsky and the New York State Bar Association said, we're not doing this PCDS law unless you provide us with a $500 credit option. We signed on to it, we got on board. Fast forward 22 years, I should say, and our position has changed because the market has become so ingrained in certain parts of the downstate marketplace in particular, that's used to sellers having that opportunity. So that's our current position. There's also a bill that passed both houses that increases the maximum fine for violations of the do not call registry from $11,000 to $20,000. I'm not aware of anybody getting fined $20,000. I'm not aware of anybody getting fined $11,000 for violating the do not call registry. I spoke to the sponsor of this bill in the Senate, a Republican, Joe Griffo of the Utica Rome area nearby Turning Stone. And I asked him, I said, Joe, what's the rationale in this almost doubling of the fine? And he said, they're having so many problems with people violating the do not call, and that he wants to give more discretion to state agencies to fine them more, because the fines at this point, he believes, are not acting as a deterrent. I would suggest to you that 11,000 and 20,000, whatever the number is, I think 11 is a fine deterrent. And I said that to him, and he said, but nobody gets fined $11,000. What happens is, I guess the violators of do not call, they plea down, it ends up being like a $250, $300, or $500 fine. So his intention is give more discretion to the state to maybe amp that $300 or $500 agreement down, or raise that to like $500 or $1,000, what have you. So we're opposed to the bill. I don't think this is legislation trying to address morality. I think here, people that are violating this do not call registry, I think they know what they're doing, and I don't think they really care about your $11,000 or $20,000 fine. And it's going to be a catch me if you can situation. So several other things in the real estate space that did not pass both houses. Some of these are good news, some of these are not as good news. Again, there were standalone bills that really came down at the 11th hour of head counting on good cause eviction. This was by far the #1 issue we were involved in for the past 2 or 3 years now. Again, it did not pass either house. I will tell you, I think if it was a standalone bill and Speaker Hastie and Majority Leader Stewart Cousins walked up and down the aisle of their respective chambers I think the vote would be very close, right? So you've got Republicans opposing it, and then you've got a handful of moderate, Democrats in both houses that we've been engaging very heavily with to stay strong, stay the course, stay opposed. And I think it would probably come down to one vote or another. But I think importantly, why this bill didn't pass either house is they know Governor Hochul would veto it. And they don't want to send a bill to the governor and then have the governor veto it, because I don't think they have the votes to override it, because you need 2/3 to override a gubernatorial veto, not just 50% plus one in New York State. So good cause eviction not happening again this year, at least temporarily. Remember, I mentioned earlier, the state assembly is coming back into a special session next week for 2 days. What they're going to do in those 2 days, I don't know. Could they pass a one-house bill on good cause eviction? Sure. Would the Senate come back to do that bill? Probably. What happens in there, I don't know. We'll have to see. Another issue that's really moving from New York City up the Hudson River to Albany is an effort to prohibit landlords from collecting what we know as landlord's fees or brokers' fees from tenants. NYSAR has been engaged at the city level for a couple of years on this issue. We are also now engaged, unfortunately, at the state level on this issue. The bill is supported by two Democratic socialists, Jabari Brisport of Brooklyn and Assembly Member Zohran Mamdani of Queens. We've had multiple conversations with Mr. Mamdani in particular about our concerns with the bill. The good news is it did not pass either house, at least right now. The third one, our efforts to essentially permit telemarketing calls during certain states of emergency. Remember, unfortunately, we're still under the guise of a law passed several years ago that prohibits telemarketing or cold calling during any state of emergency. So we've been working diligently with a coalition of other interested business parties to amend that law. The good news is we have a really terrific sponsor, and Amy Paulin from Westchester County. And Amy Paulin was able to get this bill out of the Consumer Protection Committee in the Assembly, and really over the concerns of the chair of that committee, and really have a heart-to-heart with her and get that bill on a committee agenda, get it through that committee, get it through the Rules Committee, get it to the Assembly, and that bill passed. This is the NYSAR supported bill, passed the Assembly unanimously in the last 7 days of the legislative session. Unfortunately, the state Senate, in particular state Senate staff, has told us and our partners in our coalition that they are not supportive of, as they call it, relaxing current telemarketing laws in New York State. So more to come, more to do on that. And I'm going to speak to this issue towards the end of my remarks as well. There was another bill that would fine licensed and certified real estate appraisers who violate fair housing laws and allocate a portion of those fines to the existing anti-discrimination and housing fund. This is a bill that NYSAR supports. It's on par with the bill that was passed several years ago that dealt with real estate licensees. This bill now deals with real estate appraisers. It only passed the Senate. Again, whether the Assembly takes this bill up in its package of bills next week, I don't know. We'll have to see. There was also an effort to address short-term rentals in New York State. So right now in New York, it's kind of an ad hoc or piecemeal approach across New York State. All these regulations are done at the local level. There is not a single statewide law dealing with the registration or taxes being paid or insurance required to be carried by short-term rentals in New York State. There's a bill that passed the New York State Senate by Senator Michelle Hinchey of the Hudson Valley that would create a statewide short-term rental registry. NYSAR is neutral on the bill, as we, at the end of the day, I think our members on legislative steering believe that this effort's left best to local governments to determine how they want to handle their short-term registry laws. This bill, if your community didn't have a short-term registry law, this bill would essentially impose one. And I think that's the concern for our members. The bill really, at the end of the day, doesn't go too far. But NYSAR's concern is, what if a locality doesn't want to have a law on the books? Well, the state is essentially going to say, you're going to have something on the books to address, taxes being paid, like hotel mo taxes are being paid, insurance going to be required, certain fire extinguishers in the building, et cetera. So this bill only passed one house. Unless the assembly takes it up next week, it's probably going to die in this legislative session. There is a bill that would require property owners to conduct lead paint tests and provide those reports prior to the selling or leasing of the property. So a little bit different than the state bill that was passed and enacted in the state budget. This would apply to property owners and require them to conduct a lead paint test if they don't already have one given to them by the prior owner, and provide that lead paint report to either someone that's going to rent an apartment in that building or is going to purchase that building. The bill only passed the assembly. I think the positive thing about this bill, besides just providing, I think important health information about the property that people are about to rent an apartment in or purchase, is the bill, and I think this might be a poison pill again in the bill. The bill requires and gives the ability of the property owner that has to conduct a lead paint test to essentially cover some of the cost of the lead paint test by taking a tax deduction against their real estate transfer tax obligations when they do their taxes the following year. So obviously there's a fiscal hit to the state on this. At the end of the day, the bill only passed the assembly. It did not pass the Senate, and the Senate, as I know it right now, is not planning on coming back between now and the end of the year or the beginning of the next year. And then the last bill I'll talk about that didn't pass both houses is a bill that addresses a recent U.S. Supreme Court case coming out of Minnesota, I believe, dealing with in rem foreclosures. You may have read some news about this issue. So there was a case in Minnesota that dealt with a property that was foreclosed on by a local municipality. That municipality, because the individual didn't pay their taxes, not just they took the property, they foreclosed on the property, they sold the property, and lo and behold, the property was, when they sold it, worth, let's say, $100,000 more than the tax obligations that the prior owner owed the municipality. That individual sued the municipality and won at the U.S. Supreme Court level, saying essentially that the municipality only had the right to claim that tax obligation, and any of the other proceeds would be required to be given back to the prior property owner if there was essentially a gain in the value of that property in that sale. So immediately the state legislature got engaged in the past 2 weeks since we saw that decision. And there's a bill that would place a 1-year moratorium on these in rem or municipal foreclosure actions and proceedings in New York State. That bill only passed the state Senate. I would expect the state assembly to take this up. This is a very, very complex issue. I know the New York State Conference of Mayors and New York State Association of Counties is heavily engaged in this as they deal with, the rights of the property owner and the rights of the municipality and just the processes in foreclosing on these types of properties. So I think a lot more to come on that issue. A couple of issues, and then I think we're going to have about 10 minutes of questions. There are several other issues that are simmering in the background. One is co-op transparency. I haven't talked about it yet. At the city level, we have a new sponsor. Councilmember Marjorie Velasquez of the Bronx has introduced a bill on behalf of NYSAR, Intro 1002, I believe the number is. And that bill would establish a timeline and a requirement for co-op boards to get back to prospective applicants within a certain amount of time. with a yay or nay on that application. At the New York State level, it gets a little bit more complex. The NYSAR supported bill by Senate Housing Chair Brian Kavanaugh of Manhattan and Nassau County's Assembly Member Chuck Levine. Our bill used to provide the timeline very similar to the New York City bill, but that bill was amended by Senator Kavanaugh after having several conversations with multiple fair housing groups. The fair housing groups, as I understand it, told Senator Kavanaugh, we like your bill, but we don't love it because it doesn't go far enough. And we think your bill should require a reason upon a declination by the co-op. So Senator Kavanaugh said, sounds great. I'm going to amend my bill to put it in to require that reason. The bill has been amended to require the reason. Assemblymember Levine amended his bill to require the reason. I want to make it clear that NYSAR is supportive of this obligation in the amended bill to require a reason. But as I asked Senator Kavanaugh, and the same for Assemblymember Chuck Levine's staff, we've had a tough enough time trying to get a bill out of committee that only required the timeline, let alone requiring now a reason, which, as I understand it, there are multiple people opposed to that reason requirement, including the co-op boards themselves, who are a very, very strong, viable political force among New York City-based lawmakers. And then importantly, also the Real Estate Board of New York, or REBNY. REBNY, some of you remember, have been opposed. They haven't been opposed to our timeline bill, but they've been opposed to bills that require reasons. So I think the issue, the challenge just got a little bit steeper for us. I have asked Senator Kavanaugh and Assemblymember Levine to have a sit down with the fair housing groups and NYSAR about this issue to see if we can come to some common place where we can try and get a bill moving, rather than maybe this even more difficult or challenging requirement for a reason, but we will have to see. On the telemarketing law, I mentioned earlier that there's a bill that NYSAR is supporting. I want you to know that we are also in the midst of putting together a legal challenge to the existing law prohibiting cold calling or telemarketing during any state of emergency. So we're in the midst of working with outside legal counsel to put together that legal challenge. So NYSAR is going to be suing New York State. We'll have several other plaintiffs and harmed individuals, harmed realtor members that have been impacted by this law in that lawsuit, but more to come. And unfortunately, I will say, I was talking to a fellow lobbyist last night at an event. It seems to me right now in the past 5 years that we NYSAR are getting more and more involved in legal challenges, whether it's rent regulations or when we had to sue with regard to brokers' fees, when the Department of State put out their statement several years ago and we sued and won, or good cause eviction laws we've challenged legally at the local level, and now this latest one, this telemarketing law. So I think the game here in Albany seems to be shifting a little bit more to the courts. But I think more to come in particular on that telemarketing law. On cease and desist, right now there are 2 existing cease and desist zones, one in Brooklyn and one in Rockland County. There are efforts among many lawmakers in Albany. There are bills in right now to create, for example, David Weprin has a bill in that, in the irony here is David Weprin has been a friend on good cause, but yet when we get the cease and desist, he has a bill in right now that would impose a cease and desist zone in the entire borough of Queens. So kind of a conundrum there for Mr. Weprin. But there are also efforts to turn the entire borough of Brooklyn into a cease and desist zone, parts of the Bronx back into a cease and desist zone. So an ongoing fight on cease and desist. And then the last thing I'll leave you with, actually 2 more things. The state legislature passed both houses possible changes in county and town elections. So one thing that the sponsors of the bills were trying to do is to move county and town elections to even year elections beginning after 2025. So proponents of the law say we're going to save money. Opponents of it, of this type of thing, say you're not really saving any money because the bill doesn't apply to city elections. So in odd years, you're still going to have city elections, municipal elections. So you're not really saving any money. And at the end of the day, this is partisanship at its finest. As I think in the eyes of Republicans in particular, they would be harmed by this law. So that bill is going to go to the governor for her consideration, so we'll have to see. And the last thing I'll with is just a few things in the hopper in New York City. I mentioned co-ops, broker fees is still an issue we're pushing back on. There's a real issue to address criminal background checks in New York City. The current bill that we're opposed to, that we testified with the help of Melissa Gomez. So thank you again to Melissa. I'm not sure if she's on the call. The current bill by Councilmember Powers goes too far. It bans all criminal background checks by the property owner and by the owner's agent, including real estate licensees. We think there's a more moderate approach similar to the New Jersey bill and several other models across the state that we could use. There are multiple tenant opportunity to purchase bills in New York City before the New York City Council. So giving the right to community organizations, affordable housing groups to purchase that property before the bill goes onto the open market, requiring those property owners to offer them up for sale to those groups before putting them on the open market. We think there are a lot of legal concerns with that. Once again, there is a new issue about drone regulation that's just popping up now we're looking at. And then just this week, I saw a new bill being proposed that deals with the regulation of illegal dispensaries and essentially putting the onus on the owner of commercial property to make sure that their property that they own is not being used to run an illegal dispensary in New York City. So plenty to do, plenty to come. And thanks for your time, Molo, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Sure, and it would behoove me if I didn't mention to our viewers and those who will view later that if anything that Zach and Mike said today thrills you or doesn't thrill you, just a reminder that Election Day is on November 7th, and you have every right to exercise your right to vote for the people who are in favor or not in favor of our industry. So thank you, gentlemen, for being with us today. We do have one question. I'm just going to read it aloud here. We are all impacted as realtors. Is there any way for a petition to be sent out again to all of us to sign that might help with the lawsuit? This is really impacting negatively on our business. I'm guessing, Mike, that one goes to
on the telemarketing suit. Yeah. I don't know. At this point, I'd say no on the petition. Because I don't think it helps our case yet at this point. But yeah, so it's a little bit different than a legislative effort, right? Where a petition might make sense. Like we've had multiple calls for action on this telemarketing law, but that's the legislative approach. This is a legal one. So it's not whether there's an opportunity for realtors to file an amicus brief, a friend of the court brief at some point, maybe. I'm just not certain yet, but there's no doubting that this impacts not just real estate professionals, but a lot of small businesses across New York State. Other groups like Verizon, other groups like New York State Business Council, the insurance groups like Nationwide State Farm, they're all part of this, at least on the legislative side. They're not going to be involved they may be involved in the legal side, but not in probably, again, from a friend of the court perspective. So a lot more to come.
I don't see any other questions, gentlemen. Thank you for clarifying. Zach, do you have anything else to add to our conversation today?
Just thank you all for the time. If you aren't, I'd encourage you to invest in RPAC. There's a lot going on state and nationally. So your every bit helps, and there's a lot we're fighting. Obviously here locally, and a lot of legislators in New York at the federal level that will need our help. So, and thanks for the time.
We just had one question come in. If the PCDS credit is no longer an option, how do you think this will affect disclosure issues for both sellers and their listing agents?
Well, you're gonna be required to fill it out, right? So the seller is gonna be required to complete that form. If it's signed into law, the seller is gonna be required to complete that form to the best of their knowledge. You remember, I'm a property owner here. If I sold my house today, I only have to tell the prospective purchaser what I know about the property. There's no obligation for me to know anything about the property that, happened before I owned it, right? So if there's an oil tank in the backyard, God forbid there isn't, but if there is, and I didn't put it there and I don't know anything about it, I can't be held liable from a legal standard to know about that and disclose that to the person. So yeah, I mean, I think this is gonna be a tough one because this is like a dramatic shift, I think, in what's happening in the downstate marketplace, where legal counsel is advising their clients, their seller clients, to pay the $500, avoid disclosing anything about the property, and it's a buyer beware state, and it's worth your $500 investment. So now the seller, if this becomes law, is going to have to tell their story about what they know about the property. My guess is a whole lot of sellers are going to be circling unknown on that form.
Well, anybody still listening in, if you have questions that pop into your head later while you're eating lunch or while you're going for a walk or wakes you up in the middle of the night, feel free to forward them to me at mpaventi@lirealtor.com. I'd be happy to forward it on to Zach and or Mike. Thanks everybody for attending today. Have a beautiful week. Thanks, guys.